To be honest, I'm surprised this did not happen sooner. Portland State philosophy professor Peter Boghossian has announced his resignation, saying, "My university sacrificed ideas for ideology, so today I quit." But this has been true for a long time. Not just Portland State, but most universities. I mean, we saw what happened at Evergreen with Brett Weinstein. We saw what happened with I think it was Mizzou, where that one professor was like, "Can we get some muscle over here?" trying to shut down a journalist. This is a long time coming. And I'm surprised anybody still remains at many of these jobs. Now, there is something to be said here. First, let me just tell you who Peter is. He's one of the creators or actors in the Sokol Squared hoax. Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose created fake scientific articles in the humanities and submitted them, and many got approved. One of them was just like they changed some of the words in Mein Kampf and turned it into feminist buzzwords, and it gets approved, showing that a lot of these ideologies are the same, except for many of the proper nouns. Well, now he's quitting. Universities are broken, my friend. I made a joke on Twitter. It's kind of not even a joke. I said, imagine hating your kids so much you send them to college. It's time to wake up, parents. And I'm sick of sitting here saying what I say and then hearing from working class regular Americans who watch this show saying, "Can't wait to send my kids to college." Oh, is it because you're sending your kids to STEM? You think that's going to help them? My friends, send your kids to trade school. They'll make more money. They'll have no debt. They'll be happier. Or do something else for them. College ain't it. Now, okay, I guess if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor or literally work in academia, then college makes sense. But it's shocking to me. You know, there are a lot of technical degrees, I suppose. You'll want to go into college for, some kind of STEM degree, but at this point, is it really worth it? Seeing the good teachers quit. What's left? You will send your children to these indoctrination centers, and they'll come back despising you. Because there are prerequisites. There's a funny meme where it's a webcomic. These people are sitting in class, and one guy whispers, "Hey, I thought this was the teacher says, and that's why white men are evil." And the man whispers and says, "I thought this was calculus class." And the guy goes, "This is calculus." Welcome to critical race praxis, which is basically everywhere. You will go to learn a math problem, and they'll say, "John is a white man who was stopped by the police 13 times this year, while Andre is a black man stopped 392. What percentage increase between the two?" That's what you're getting. Now, I know that problem specifically is a reference to grade schools. But of course, these universities, you are not going to be free from the insanity. Take a look at what happened with, I think it was Nick Christakis was his name. Or maybe I'm getting the name wrong. But there's that famous viral video from years ago of a young woman saying, college is not about creating a space for an intellectual environment. It's about creating a safe family or something. Or she's like, it's not about creating an environment to learn. It's about creating a safe place for us to. No. College is where you're supposed to be learning these subject matter, these majors, becoming a specialist in some capacity. They don't do that. But by all means, condemn your kids. It really, really, really is frustrating for me to watch when I see people on Twitter be like, conservatives even being like, I just want to make sure I can get my kids in college. Why? Have you been paying attention to anything we've been talking about? Apparently not. I know a lot of people who went to college who are good people and smart people, challenging the lies and manipulations. But for what? Look, maybe colleges meant something a decade ago or 2 decades ago, but there are major changes happening right now. And for this, we are seeing the good professors quit from the Daily Mail. Peter Boghossian has taught philosophy at Portland State University for the past decade. In the letter below, sent this morning to the university's provost, he explains why he is resigning, saying, "Dear Provost Susan Jeffords, I'm writing to you today to resign as assistant professor of philosophy at Portland State University. Over the last decade, it has been my privilege to teach at the university. My specialties are critical thinking, ethics, and the Socratic method. And I teach classes like science and pseudoscience and the philosophy of education. But in addition to exploring classic philosophers and traditional texts, I've invited a wide range of guest lecturers to address my classes, from flat earthers to Christian apologists to global climate change skeptics to Occupy Wall Street advocates. I'm proud of my work. I invited those speakers not because I agreed with their worldviews, but primarily because I didn't. From those messy and difficult conversations, I've seen the best of what our students can achieve. Questioning beliefs while respecting believers, staying even-tempered in challenging circumstances, and even changing their minds. I never once believed, nor do I now, that the purpose of instruction was to lead my students to a particular conclusion. Rather, I sought to create the conditions for rigorous thought, to help them to gain the tools to hunt and furrow for their own conclusions. This is why I became a teacher and why I love teaching. But brick by brick, the university has made this kind of intellectual exploration impossible. It has transformed a bastion of free inquiry into a social justice factory whose only inputs were race, gender, and victimhood, and whose only outputs were grievance and division. Students at Portland State are not being taught to think. Rather, they are being trained to mimic the moral certainty of ideologues. Faculty and administrators have abdicated the university's truth-seeking mission and instead drive intolerance of divergent beliefs and opinions. This has created a culture of offense where students are now afraid to speak openly and honestly. And we'll read on in a second, but I'll interject some points here. I'm surprised it took this long, as I stated in the beginning, because it was several years ago that I sat down with Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, and we had a conversation about what was going on. But you know what? Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Now, the reason I say this is because I had a debate with Peter Boghossian about the origins of all of his wacky wokeism. My view is that social media manipulation and algorithms have created this world. Peter Boghossian's view is that it started in the universities with critical race theory in the late 70s and 80s. I believe he's wrong. I mean, obviously, critical race theory started in the universities. But what we're seeing in wokeism is not just critical race theory. Though it certainly has adopted many of its tenets, it's something else. It's an amalgam. It's some beast. But I think this whole thing proves me right in the debate, Peter. Would love to have you on the show and talk about it. The ideas existed for a long time. The ideas were shared for a long time. But in a university environment where people like you, Peter, allow free inquiry, these ideas did not flourish. They've been around since the late 70s and 80s, and only now in 2020, we're seeing it get so bad. 2021, I mean to say the decade, but in 2021 now, you're resigning? Yes, because what I think is actually happening is that social media created the atmosphere, the environment for which these ideas flourish and spread. The ideas are stupid. You have to be a weak fool to believe the lies espoused by these people. So I'll tell you this. Derek Bell, critical race theorist, when he advocated for Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, regular people in universities seeing that those ideas challenged them. Why? Because they had good professors. But something changed. Now the good professors are leaving. Barry Weiss leaves the New York Times. Peter Boghossian leaves Portland State. Why now and why not 30 years ago when the ideas were being propagated? Well, perhaps you could argue that it took some time for these ideas to bubble up and gain momentum. That's true. But then why not in the 90s, in the 2000s, when Derek Bell was giving his speech on why he supported segregation? Why now? Social media. You see, the New York Times wasn't talking about critical theory, racism, whiteness until the advent of social media, when LexisNexis saw the massive spike. Now, there is an argument, and I'll attempt to steelman Peter Boghossian's side on this one, considering he's not here, that once the young people who grew up indoctrinated by these ideas became teachers. So you have the critical race theorists in the 80s. These kids grow up and become academics themselves. Now it's the 90s. Now they're teaching 10 times as many people. Those kids then teach 10 times as many people. And then exponential outpouring results in the New York Times hiring young people who all of a sudden are interested in these ideas. I don't think that's it. What my argument here is, while it may be true that critical race theory and critical praxis and wokeism, intersectionality in schools probably did have an exponential growth, the New York Times had no reason to embrace these ideas when 80% of their market does not care for it. You see? To put it mildly, just because a bunch of millennials getting out of college believe this psychobabble doesn't mean the New York Times is going to be like, well, most of our readership is in their mid to late 40s. Let's pander to the millennials. Now you could argue they started hiring millennials, and the millennials started writing articles about racism and xenophobia and whiteness. But it doesn't explain how the Gen Xers and boomers running the New York Times would just abdicate responsibility and their moral standing to millennial interns. So I'll tell you what happened in the late 2000s as to why we saw LexisNexis showing that all of these news outlets started adopting critical race theory, wokeness, and intersectionality. Algorithms. You've heard me say it a million times. And this to me, and I believe this explains why Peter Boghossian is only resigning now. Here's what happened. And forgive me if you've heard this explanation, but it bears repeating. It's important. With the rise of Facebook, predominantly Facebook, people who interacted with some content were fed more of the same. People would share specific content because it triggered their emotions. As we know from a lot of research and a great video by CGP Grey called This Video Will Make You Angry, I think it's called something like that, the most powerful emotion on the internet is rage. So what happened? Well, in the mid-2000s, the bloggers that started emerging that got the most traffic were those writing about things to make you angry. So let's say you saw on Facebook racism. Well, we all hate racism, right? Except for racists. So you'd click it and you'd be like, I'm angry about this racism. That's not fun. Then someone else would write about sexism. And you'd click it because, hey, sexism is bad too. But then someone discovered something. It's not just racism articles being X and sexism articles being Y, and then you get X plus Y in terms of your... So let's say someone writes a racism article, someone else writes a sexism article, and then someone writes a racist, sexist article, like about racism and sexism. It's not X plus Y views. It's something different, but it's more akin to X times Y views. To put it simply, intersectionality, which started to come up first, predominantly with these YouTubers, functions because writing about two keywords is more likely to be algorithmically fed to people than anything else. Why then millennials? Because they were the ones using this new tech. It wasn't the universities. The ideas existed. Once the platforms were created and the algorithms existed that sought to exploit these feelings of anger and injustice and a lack of purpose, outlets emerged like Mike.com, which initially, according to one expose, was like pro-Ron Paul. But then what did they see? When you combined all of these rage keywords, you got more traffic. Because now instead of reaching one subculture, you reach all of them. An exponential boost because with the more views you get, the more likely Facebook is to recommend it to people who are uninitiated and don't know about these things. So it's more akin to X times Y views. In fact, the more keywords you cram in there, trans, women of color, attacked by police, proof that Black Lives Matter is the reason for abolishing the police. They put all those things in the headline, and then it's A times B times C times D times E times F, and boom! The money was pouring in, business was a booming, and that's why the New York Times, Huffington Post, all of these places started shifting very heavily into these narratives. Now, to be fair, Huffington Post always was pretty much there. But why would Gen Xers, who are very offensive in their comedy, boomers, even more offensive in their comedy, start pandering to this woke ideology? Money to be made. So I'll say this, and then we'll get back to Peter's letter. Why is it that only now Peter Boghossian is quitting when Peter himself has said these ideas have been bubbling up in universities since the late 70s and 80s? Because of the algorithmic manipulation, this ideology existed and was able to find a place to latch onto. That's why I'm not a fan of railing on critical race theory exclusively. Look, Chris Rufo does a great job. James Lindsay does a great job. But they talk about critical race theory and they ignore critical gender theory. They ignore intersectionality and wokeism in general, which is a broad overarching umbrella of a bunch of insanity. Critical race theory is specifically about critical theory, Marxist ideas, and the oppressed versus oppressor in race. But that doesn't explain cancel culture. That doesn't explain the gender theory. It doesn't explain the takeover of these institutions. No, it's all about oppressed and oppressor generally, but more importantly, it's about tribal power. And they use the oppressed oppressor thing for gain. Marxism is probably a better way to put it. So that's why I think Peter is wrong in this regard. And that's why I think only now he's resigning. The expansion of social media, their power, and what's happening is young people being indoctrinated by these tech communication systems. Schools can say whatever they want. For that matter, if it were true that this started in the universities and became more pronounced there, why didn't the Socratic method persist, right? Certainly, if you have a school that's teaching people critical race theory and you have professors teaching the Socratic method, why is not the philosophy of the great thinkers the more dominant ideology? I certainly think it has the merit, and I think the other ideas are lacking and nonsensical. It's because the Socratic method doesn't make you money on these big tech platforms. The Socratic method doesn't generate investment. No. Rage bait does. Peter says, I noticed signs of the illiberalism that has now fully swallowed the academy quite early during my time at Portland State. I witnessed students refusing to engage with different points of view. Questions from faculty at diversity trainings that challenged approved narratives were instantly dismissed. Those who asked for evidence to justify new institutional policies were accused of microaggressions. And professors were accused of bigotry for assigning canonical texts written by philosophers who happened to have been European and male. At first, I didn't realize how systemic this was, and I believed I could question this new culture. So I began asking questions. What is the evidence that trigger warnings and safe spaces contribute to student learning? Why should racial consciousness be the lens through which we view our role as educators? How did we decide that cultural appropriation is immoral? Unlike my colleagues, I asked these questions loud and in public. I decided to study the new values that were engulfing Portland State and so many other educational institutions. Values that sound wonderful, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but might actually be just the opposite. The more I read the primary source material produced by critical theorists, the more I suspected that their conclusions reflected the postulates of an ideology, not insights based on evidence. And I'll stop here again. Once again, I believe this is more evidence to my theory, my hypothesis that the internet made this. You can be in school and surrounded by people saying X equals 1. But then you can go turn on the news and they say X equals 2. And what's more important? Well, it could depend, honestly. I think there's a combination of factors here, but I think the greater culture has more power. People who are in college look up to celebrities. They want to be like other people. They want to be famous. They want to be respected in their careers. So what's more important? Their social media feeds, their greater circle. Sure, you can sit down in a classroom and have a feminist teacher tell you that, men are misogynists, all men are misogynists or whatever. But when you go on Facebook, what you're seeing from your friends becomes your reality. And if you see nothing but police brutality videos, you'll believe the cops are all evil. If you see nothing but stories of racism, you'll think the country is evil and racist. Your friends can say a lot of things, but it's the worldview that's generated through the algorithms that will impact what you believe is true and correct. And then when you do, and there is a dissonance between the real world and your algorithmic reality, you'll become angry and violent when it's challenged. So I think that explains it more. Now, this is where it gets crazy. Peter Boghossian goes on to say that he was accused of a student in 2016, 2017 and was investigated under Title IX. Apparently, the investigators had been asking his students if he had been beating his wife and children. These people are cult members. They have no morals. They were taught no morals. That has nothing to do with critical race theory. No, let's be honest. Nothing in Kimberly Crenshaw's writings, as far as I know, I haven't read every single bit, but my understanding of critical race theory, they don't say throw away all semblance of honest, rational thought. No, they claim to be rational thinkers. The rage. That's what I've long been questioning. Why the rage? Have you noticed it? The infection that's sweeping across people in the United States and around the world, to be honest. The anger, the hatred, the bloodlust, the people demanding that Joe Rogan die of COVID on Twitter. What is wrong with these people? There are people in my own family who have just become rage monsters that you dare say anything and they scream. Are universities teaching people to be hateful and just flip tables and bang and smash windows? I don't believe so. I believe they do contribute to indoctrination. And I believe it's because universities are profit-generating machines that saw what young people wanted and gave it to them. I'll give you another example. With Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, and all these other weirdos in universities and teaching and speaking, why didn't this happen sooner? Why is it that professors challenge their students and the students are the ones saying it's not about an intellectual space, it's about a family? Because they're getting the ideas from social media, not from professors who challenge them. Although there are many professors who don't. And these people are in a cult. They've been indoctrinated on social media. They revel in being angry, vile monsters because you get clicks for it. You get rewarded for it. Going on social media and calling someone a name gets you retweets. So they do it. And then in the real life, they do it more. It is social media algorithmic psychosis. That's why it's all happening now. And that's why I think Peter Boghossian finally couldn't take it. And that's why somebody was willing to lie. Why? How many hate crime hoaxes have we seen? Are universities teaching these kids to do this? Perhaps. In the ethos of there's no truth but power, some university professors probably do teach their kids this. Or maybe it's that they're watching it work on social media and they want a piece of the pie. In the end, Peter Boghossian says, this is not the outcome I wanted, but I feel morally obligated to make this choice. For 10 years, I have taught my students the importance of living by your principles. One of mine is to defend our system of liberal education from those who seek to destroy it. Who would I be if I didn't? Sincerely, Peter Boghossian. I think it's bad news because we need Peter Boghossian at these schools pushing back. But universities are corrupted. So I'll say it again. Imagine hating your children so much that you send them to college. Imagine hating your children so much that you send them to college. Yeah. Get them out of these places. Send them to trade school or something. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. over at youtube.com/Timcast. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.